In a world where wealth often separates lives, one lost boy would bring them crashing together. When 7-year-old Aidan Ward, the only son of a cold, calculating billionaire, vanishes into the wilderness during a countryside retreat, a desperate search erupts across the nation. Helicopters whirl overhead, reward money floods the news, and elite search teams scour the land. But no one finds him. Not until Elias Navarro, a poor, widowed farmer living on the edge of the forest, hears something in the night. Ignored by the authorities and shunned by society, Elias follows a faint cry deep into the woods, risking everything. After 47 harrowing hours, he emerges, cradling the missing boy. What happens next stuns the world. A helicopter slices through the sky, descending on Elias's dusty field. Out steps Celine Ward, billionaire, media mogul, and Aidan's mother. She expected a miracle, but not this man. What follows is a story of contrasts and connection, of a broken mother, a grieving farmer, and a child who bridges their worlds. Fame, fortune, and forgiveness collide in the most unexpected way. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the hills of Stone Marrow Valley when the world of the rich cracked open. It was meant to be a perfect weekend. Celine Ward, the billionaire founder of WardCore Technologies, had planned it with clinical precision. A private estate tucked away in the countryside, far from the noise of the city. No reporters, no shareholders, no scandals. Just a quiet retreat for her executive board and their families. It was her attempt to humanize herself for the media, to show the world she was still capable of warmth, or at least capable of pretending. Aidan Ward, her 7-year-old son, wasn't supposed to be there at all. The original plan was to leave him with the nanny in San Francisco, but Aidan had thrown a rare tantrum the morning they left. He wanted to go where the mountains were. He wanted to see the deer and feed the horses. Celine, always negotiating time, allowed him to come. She told herself it would be fine. He was quiet, solitary, rarely a source of trouble. Until he disappeared. It happened sometime between late afternoon and early evening. One moment he was at the edge of the garden maze, poking at wild flowers with a stick. The next, he was gone. At first, no one panicked. The property was enclosed. Security systems were active. They assumed he'd wandered toward the orchard or followed a butterfly. One of the interns was sent to look, then another. When 30 minutes passed with no sign of him, Celine's COO called in the estate security. An hour later, drones were launched. By nightfall, the police had been contacted, and Celine was screaming into her satellite phone, mobilizing private trackers and aerial surveillance. The forest surrounding the estate was deep and jagged, scarred with cliffs and gullies. There were stories, old ones, about children getting lost in those woods, about creatures and caves and vanishing lights. But that was folklore nonsense. This was modern-day California, and Celine Ward did not believe in ghosts. Still, as the cold crept in and her son remained missing, dread wrapped itself around her like a steel chain. Her perfectly composed mask began to fracture. Her phone buzzed constantly. Updates, false sightings, logistical questions. She didn't sleep. She didn't eat. Her eyes never left the monitors. The reward was posted. $1 million to anyone who returned Aidan alive. The media frenzy was immediate. By morning, the story had exploded. Billionaire's son missing in rural woods. Reporters flooded nearby towns. Rescue crews, volunteers, even bounty hunters arrived with dogs and high-tech gear. Celine's people managed most of them, keeping them out of her sight. She was unraveling, silently, strategically. 40 hours passed. Then came whispers, faint, irritating murmurs from the locals. A poor farmer, they said, might have seen something. A strange man who lived alone, barely spoke, whose fields touched the forest edge. Celine didn't hear the whispers. She wouldn't have cared. The man didn't matter. But he was already moving. He had been since nightfall. Elias Navarro had heard the cry, a single cry, faint but unmistakably human, carried on the wind across his barren field. Most would have dismissed it, but Elias was not most. He had once heard a similar cry, years ago, the night his own son died in a flood. He could not stop. That memory still burned in his bones. So when the cry came again, sharper this time, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed his lantern, his worn boots, and a coil of rope. No phone, no radio, just instinct. Elias moved like a shadow across the boundary of his land, where wheat turned to pine and the wild things began. He didn't know the boy's name. He didn't care about rewards. All he knew was that somewhere out there, a child was afraid, and no one else had heard him. As the second night swallowed the sky and Celine Ward stood surrounded by blinking screens and silent maps, Elias Navarro disappeared into the forest with nothing but a dim light and an aching heart, and the world, still spinning on its polished, indifferent axis, had no idea that everything was about to change. By the time dawn broke over Stone Marrow Valley, the rolling hills were crawling with people. Police cruisers lined the winding dirt roads. Emergency responders combed the surrounding woods in organized quadrants. Helicopters hovered like angry hornets, blades cutting through the cold morning air. Celine's private security force, dressed in matte black with earpieces and tactically casual polos, spread like a second layer over the official presence. Each hour the boy remained missing added pressure. Cameras flashed. Drones buzzed overhead. Satellite scans were reviewed. Body heat signatures analyzed. But all the data in the world couldn't find a child swallowed by the trees. Celine Ward hadn't left her command center in 20 hours. The estate's private ballroom had been converted into an impromptu crisis headquarters. Her chief of staff, publicist, legal advisor, and a rotation of field liaisons worked in shifts to manage the growing chaos. On screen, search zones pulsed red. Drones returned with thermal maps and nothing else. Bloodhounds picked up faint trails only to lose them at the edge of a riverbed. And still, no sign of Aiden. Celine didn't weep. She didn't scream anymore either. Her face was locked in that steely, unreadable calm that had earned her both admiration and fear in boardrooms around the globe. But underneath she was spiraling. She had built satellites, broken industries, and changed the world with her code. But none of that could locate her son. By noon, the media had arrived in force. CNN, Reuters, international outlets. The story was too big to ignore. Billionaire's son missing. 47-hour search reaches critical stage. Paparazzi scaled fences. A rogue drone nearly collided with a rescue chopper before being shot out of the sky. The spectacle swelled. Across the valley, locals watched with wary detachment. Some volunteered. Others grumbled about rich people stirring up the land. A few sold directions to news vans or hosted reporters in barns for a fee. And then there was Elias Navarro. He had returned just after sunrise, face streaked with mud and eyes bloodshot. He said nothing to the deputies guarding the road near his property, just nodded once and slipped into his farmhouse, closing the door behind him. He had not found the boy, but he had found something. A footprint, tiny, fresh, leading toward a thicket by the ravine. Elias was exhausted but not done. He would rest for an hour, maybe two. Then he would return, because he could still hear the crying in his mind. Elias Navarro was the kind of man people noticed once and forgot twice. He lived on 38 acres of failing land, most of it wild and uncultivated. His house was a faded A-frame with broken shutters and a stubborn porch swing that squeaked like a memory. His closest neighbor was 5 miles away. His phone hadn't worked in 3 years, and he preferred it that way. The town knew of him, whispered about him. They said he was strange, quiet, a man with no smile, no wife, no visitors. Some thought he was dangerous, others just thought he was sad. They were both right. 10 years ago, Elias had a family. His wife, Leona, was the only woman who ever softened his stormy silence, and their son, Mateo, was a whirlwind of laughter, always barefoot, always muddy, but the rain had taken them both. A flash flood from the mountain ridge caught them while Elias was in town, buying parts for a broken tractor. By the time he returned, the water had receded, and so had his reason to speak. Since then, Elias had kept to his land. He grew just enough to survive, sold vegetables to the market when he had extra, repaired fences and tended bees. The only noise in his home came from wind chimes and the occasional AM radio broadcast when the storm didn't muffle the signal. But despite the silence, Elias listened. He listened to the land, the weather, the forest. He knew when coyotes were hunting by the smell of the air. He could tell how far off a thunderstorm was by the bend of the trees. So when he heard the child's cry in the night, he hadn't questioned it. He hadn't assumed it was a bird or some trick of the wind. He'd heard the exact same sound before, the cry of a child who had no idea where they were, and a father who was no longer there to answer. Elias sat now at his kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug. The photo of Mateo stared at him from the windowsill. Every search in these woods brought that day back, but this time felt different. This wasn't a memory chasing him, it was real. A boy was out there, someone's boy, and no matter what the world thought of Elias Navarro, he wasn't going to stop until that boy was found. He stood up, pulling his boots on slowly. His knees cracked, his back arched, but his hands were steady. He grabbed the lantern, a coil of rope, and a small thermos of water. There were hours of light left, and he had a trail to follow. Out in the field, the media circus roared louder than ever. But inside the forest, Elias was the only one listening. Elias walked to the ranger checkpoint at the edge of the main search grid just after 2 p.m. The sun was glaring overhead, but the air was cool and sharp. He waited patiently as a deputy, barely older than the boots he was wearing, blocked his way with a clipboard and a look of practiced authority. "I think I found a sign," Elias said plainly. "Kid's Trail near the East Ravine, about a mile past the orange boundary tape." The deputy barely looked up. "Sir, unless you're part of the designated search teams or a registered volunteer, I'm going to have to ask you to return to the public observation point." "I live here," Elias said. "This is my land." "That may be true," the deputy replied, checking a name tag as if it were a badge of reason. "But this is now an active investigation under federal and private jurisdiction." Elias stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked away. He'd seen it before. The way certain uniforms looked past him, the way rich people stepped around him like he was part of the soil. His clothes didn't fit the image of a savior. His truck didn't beep when reversed. His face didn't show up in search engine bios. He didn't matter, not to them, but he mattered to the land. He cut across a hayfield, ducked behind a corroded barbed wire fence, and entered the forest again, this time with purpose. Back at the estate, Celine Ward was being briefed by a polished ex-military strategist about search sector recalibration. Someone handed her a protein bar. She ignored it. She hadn't spoken to Aiden in 3 days before the trip. She'd been too busy. There had always been an excuse. Quarterly review, investor calls, the quiet but growing boardroom rebellion. Her son had become another checkbox. Now, as she looked out at the endless horizon of trees, she realized that the checkbox might never be filled again. If she had noticed a quiet man in work-worn denim walking along the ridgeline, she might have wondered who he was. But she didn't. Elias, meanwhile, was already disappearing into the forest, into the place where the polished shoes and scheduled updates never went. Celine's world had always been one of control. She controlled markets, supply chains, public narratives, and private lives. From her first IPO to her last acquisition, she had made calculated, brilliant moves in a world that devoured the slow and doubted the compassionate. She had learned early, care made you weak, distance makes you strong. But now her son is gone, and no algorithm could bring him back. She sat in the mobile command center surrounded by tech, satellite feeds, GPS, mapping overlays, predictive movement modeling. None of it meant anything. Aiden isn't a fugitive, she snapped at one of her own analysts. He's 7. Stop running criminal pursuit simulations. The room fell silent. Outside, a journalist tried to capture her through the tinted windows. Celine ignored the camera, but not the shame that began to seep through her carefully constructed armor. She had money. She had power. But at that moment, she had no idea where her son was. Her private detective, a wiry woman named Maeve with sharp eyes and no patience, knocked softly and entered. No progress on the reward leads, Maeve said. Mostly cranks, attention seekers, or opportunists. And the local man? Celine asked. Maeve raised an eyebrow. The farmer? Celine nodded. We dismissed him. No credentials. Doesn't seem mentally reliable. One deputy said he smelled like creek mud and pine. Celine's jaw tightened. Get me a full profile. Maeve hesitated. He's not our best lead. He's someone, Celine snapped. Even desperation had to be organized, but Celine was beginning to understand something terrifying. Her money might be useless here, her reach, her influence. It all ended where the trees began. Somewhere out there was her son, lost, afraid, and maybe, just maybe, the person closest to finding him was the man everyone else had already forgotten. 40 hours into the search, exhaustion began to fray even the most professional edges. The official teams, now bloated with volunteers, had combed through every square foot of the immediate estate and its bordering lands. They found boot prints, wrappers, animal tracks, even a tiny red sneaker. But it was the wrong brand, not Aiden's. Celine's private teams hit a wall of their own. Advanced heat sensors failed to differentiate a child from a fox. Cadaver dogs barked at buried raccoon bones. Several reported sightings turned out to be other children playing nearby. brought in by curiosity or by parents hoping for reward money. Frustration grew. Tension exploded in whispers. Some blamed the estate's security team for not keeping a better eye on Aiden. Others blamed Celine. Who brings a child to a corporate retreat in the middle of nowhere? One aide muttered. Celine heard it and said nothing. She was tired, past anger. She went to Aiden's room, one of the guest suites in the manor. She picked up his sweater, the one he wore when he vanished. It still smelled faintly of him. Dirt, soap, strawberries. She held it for a long time. Then she curled up on the bed and shut her eyes just for a minute. Meanwhile, far beyond the official search grid, Elias Navarro knelt by a muddy creek bed. There it was again, a small handprint in the moss, the edge of a crumpled granola bar wrapper, familiar, store-bought, upper shelf. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The boy was close, and no one else was looking in the right place. It was nearly midnight when Elias heard it again. He had taken shelter under a ridge of limestone where the pines grew thick and the wind carried secrets. The moonlight filtered in slats through the canopy, casting silver veins across the damp earth. He sat there quietly, wrapped in his old coat, cradling a thermos and listening, not just with his ears, but with the part of him that had learned the language of the wild. Then came the sound, faint, raw, a human sound, not an animal's whimper or the moan of bending trees. It was a cry, a single choked sob. Elias stood slowly. Every muscle in his back and legs complained, but he didn't care. He turned off the lantern. He needed silence now, total silence. He moved like a shadow, boots pressing soft indentations into the moss. There was a tangle of undergrowth up ahead, dense with brush and brambles. He slipped through it, pushing branches aside with one hand and steadying himself against gnarled trunks with the other. Then it came again, closer. This time, a word. "Mom!" Elias's breath caught. He froze. It wasn't a scream. It was the kind of sound a child makes when they're too tired to shout, when they're not even sure anyone's coming. He followed the voice, slowly, carefully, over a shallow creek, up a muddy incline. And then a shape, curled beneath the roots of a fallen tree, small, shivering. Elias approached with his hands open, heart pounding like a drum. "Hey there," he said, voice as soft as moss. The child flinched, then blinked up at him with wide, tear-streaked eyes. It was him, Aiden Ward. Found. Aiden's lips were cracked, his face was smeared with dirt, and his clothes were soaked through. His left arm was cradled to his chest, possibly sprained, maybe worse, but he was breathing, awake, alive. Elias crouched beside him, heart racing. He remembered every moment of the night Mateo had vanished. The way the ground swallowed time, the way the dark made a child's voice disappear. He reached into his coat and pulled out the thermos, unscrewed the lid, and offered it. "Just a sip," Elias said. Aiden hesitated, then drank. His small hands shaking so badly, Elias had to steady the cup. When he finished, the boy looked up at him. You're not a cop," he mumbled. "No," Elias replied. "Are you gonna take me back?" "Yes." Aiden leaned into him then, not like a hug, more like gravity, as if his small body had held on as long as it could, and now it was done. Elias wrapped his coat around the boy and lifted him gently, feeling the weight of life in his arms. The hike back wouldn't be easy, not in the dark, not through the terrain he'd crossed, but the boy was here. That was all that mattered. Elias began the slow journey out of the woods, each step echoing with more than just purpose. It echoed with something like hope. The fog had rolled in, thick and low, veiling everything in gray. But Elias kept walking, because now he wasn't alone. They moved carefully through the undergrowth, Elias cradling Aiden against his chest. Every root and slope posed a danger, not just to him, but to the fragile boy in his arms. The weight was not unbearable, but the responsibility was. Elias didn't speak much, only murmured things now and then. "We're all right." "Hold on, son." "Almost there." Words more for himself than the boy. Around them the forest was alive with night sounds, owls, insects, the distant rush of water. But Elias listened for something else. Silence. The unnatural kind. The kind that says, "You're being watched." Years of living close to nature had trained him in subtleties, and right now the forest felt still. Too still. At a small clearing, Elias paused to shift his grip. Aiden stirred. "I heard the river," Aiden said weakly. "I tried to go to it." Elias nodded. "You're close now." He checked the muddy ground beneath them and noticed something else. Prints. His own tracks from earlier, now overlaid with others. He bent low, still holding Aiden in one arm, and traced a partial boot print. Not his. Someone had been here. Searchers, or something else. He adjusted course, angling east toward the ridge where he'd seen the signal tower days earlier. If he could get near it, he might find a road, a ranger trail, a place with reception. Aiden's breathing was shallow but steady. Elias tightened his grip. "Just a little longer, boy." Somewhere above, the clouds were beginning to break. The moonlight slipped through like threads of silver, guiding their path. And Elias Navarro, ignored, invisible, walked like a ghost through the forest, carrying hope through the darkness. The farther Elias carried the boy, the deeper he sank into memory. The forest around him might have been the same as it was a decade ago. Same gnarled trees, same bird calls. But Elias wasn't the same man, and the weight in his arms now was eerily familiar. Mateo had been just 6 when the rains came. It wasn't supposed to flood that day. The warnings came too late. Elias had left for town, convinced he'd be back in time, with the new generator belt and 2 sacks of flour. But nature doesn't bargain. By the time he returned, his house was gone. His wife's body had been found 3 miles downstream. Mateo's was never recovered. That fact had etched itself into Elias's soul, like rust into metal. A wound that never healed, just grew quieter. So when he'd heard that cry 2 nights ago, everything in him woke up. The grief, the guilt, the need to do something this time. He wasn't about to fail again. As he walked through the trees with Aiden's tiny form pressed to his chest, he whispered to his son's ghost, "This time I will bring the boy home." The forest seemed to hush in agreement. Aiden stirred again as the trees thinned near the edge of a dry gully. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment he looked confused, unsure if the man carrying him was friend or foe. "My name's Elias," the farmer said softly. "You're safe." Aiden nodded once, his lips too dry for words. Elias shifted his grip and continued. The trees were growing less dense now, the terrain more forgiving, and there, just ahead, he spotted it. A strip of red plastic flagging tape fluttering from a branch. Search zone boundary. He exhaled, steadying his steps. If he could get to the far hill, there might be cell signal, maybe a trail camera, maybe even a patrol. He climbed carefully, each step calculated. His knees burned with effort, his shoulders ached, but he didn't stop. At the summit, a gust of wind parted the clouds, and for the first time in 2 days, Elias could see lights, not stars, floodlights, bright, artificial. The search team's mobile base, less than 2 miles away. He let out a short, relieved grunt, but the sound startled Aiden, who whimpered and clutched tighter to his collar. "You're all right," Elias whispered again. They were almost there. He didn't know it yet, but the moment he stepped into view of that camp, the world would change. Back at the mobile base, the command team was in triage mode. The longer the boy remained missing, the more medical complications loomed. Dehydration, shock, exposure. The terrain was unforgiving, the nights cold and wet. Statistically, if Aiden wasn't found by sunrise, survival odds dropped to 50%. Celine sat silently at the table, her face blank. She had crossed over into a place beyond fear, into the hollow space where nothing makes sense, where every second is a wait and every possibility worse than the last. Maeve returned from another fruitless check-in. "No confirmed sightings," she said, "still filtering calls. We're running out of time." Then came the shout. From outside the tent, a ranger's voice cracked through the static. "We've got movement on Sector Delta, approaching from the ridge." A cluster of personnel scrambled. The screens flickered as a long-range camera zoomed in. At first, all they saw was a shape, then a man carrying something. Celine stood knocking over a metal cup. The cameras refocused. The child was limp, wrapped in a coat twice his size. But he was alive, moving. The man looked like he'd walked through hell. "Who is that?" someone asked. No one answered, because the man was already crossing the final barrier, heading straight toward them. And Celine, the woman who had once ruled empires from her phone, was running barefoot across the mud toward her son. Elias didn't break stride as a crowd of uniforms and floodlights descended on him. His boots hit the loose gravel of the outer perimeter, just as 3 paramedics reached him with a stretcher. One reached out, but Elias paused, unwilling to release Aiden too soon. The boy, now semi-conscious, clung to his coat like ivy to stone. "Easy," Elias said gruffly. "He's been through a lot." The lead medic nodded. "We'll be gentle. You did good, sir." Only then did Elias kneel and allow them to take the boy from his arms. Aiden whimpered as the paramedics adjusted his position, but he didn't protest. He was too weak. They checked his vitals, wrapped him in blankets, and lifted him into the emergency vehicle, already humming nearby. Elias stood silently, unsure what to do now that his mission was over. Then came the voice. "Aiden!" Celine. She tore across the clearing, slipping once in the mud. Her black coat streamed behind her like a cape, her face pale and frantic. She reached the stretcher just as they were about to lift it into the truck. "Mom!" Aiden rasped, barely audible. Celine broke. She fell to her knees beside the gurney and wrapped her arms around him as carefully as she could. I've got you, baby." Aiden closed his eyes and smiled faintly. For the first time in her life, Celine cried in front of people and didn't care. While the medical team swarmed around Aiden, Elias stood off to the side, unnoticed by most, just a shadow in the chaos, watching as the boy disappeared into the back of the ambulance. surrounded by warmth and technology. He wiped the sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. The adrenaline that had sustained him for hours was now fading, leaving behind a heaviness that reached into his bones. "Sir," a young officer finally said, approaching hesitantly, "we're going to need a statement from you." Elias nodded once. "Later." He didn't mean to be rude. He was just tired. Not just the kind of tiredness that came from hiking through a forest with a child in your arms, but the tiredness that came from remembering too much, from carrying a decade of ghosts and guilt on his back. He turned to leave, but before he could walk more than 10 steps, he heard her voice again. "Wait!" Celine stood in the mud, her hair undone, her clothes ruined, but her presence was still undeniable, the aura of command, the weight of someone used to being obeyed. But now she looked at Elias as something else, grateful. "You found him," she said quietly. "You saved my son." Elias just nodded. "He did most of the work. I just followed the signs." Celine stepped forward. "What's your name?" "Elias." "I want to thank you properly, Elias." He nodded again and walked away. He didn't need thanks. The boy was safe. That was enough. News of the boy's rescue swept across the valley like a spring wind. By dawn, local radio stations were running the headline, "Missing boy found alive after 47 hours, saved by local farmer." Social media lit up with praise and disbelief. Photos of Elias, mud-streaked, eyes shadowed under a worn cap, began to circulate. Someone from the search team had snapped a candid shot, and it had gone viral. Real-life hero. Poor man with a heart of gold. Billionaire's son found by someone the world forgot. But in the town of Pine Grove, where Elias had lived quietly for years, reactions were more complex. Some people beamed with pride. "That's Elias Navarro," said Mrs. Grady, the postmaster. "Always knew he had something noble in him." Others were suspicious. "Why was he the one who found the boy?" muttered a man at the diner. "How'd he know where to look?" A few, jealous or skeptical, whispered darker theories, but the majority saw Elias for what he was, someone who had done what hundreds hadn't. At the local grocery, the cashier set aside a paper bag with his name on it, no charge. At the diner, they put up a sign, "Hero eats free." Elias didn't notice any of it. He returned home the same way he left, quietly, without ceremony. He stripped off his muddy clothes, showered, and sat at his kitchen table staring at the picture of Mateo. The ache in his heart was no less than before, but something else sat beside it now, peace. And for the first time in years, Elias Navarro allowed himself to rest. 48 hours after her son vanished, Celine Ward returned to the estate, not in a black SUV, but in a sleek graphite helicopter. The rotors beat against the earth like a war drum as the chopper descended into the open field near the command post. Camera crews, emergency workers, and journalists craned their necks to catch the dramatic arrival. Out stepped Celine Ward. She wore no makeup. Her coat was wrinkled. Her eyes were dark with exhaustion, and none of it dulled the gravity of her presence. She cut across the field like someone who knew how to command a room, even when that room was in the wilderness. At her side, 2 bodyguards and a PR manager struggled to keep up, but Celine's attention was fixed on the tent where her son lay recovering. Inside, Aiden rested on a cot wrapped in 3 thermal blankets. A pediatric trauma nurse hovered nearby. The boy was conscious, talking softly to the paramedics about the man in the woods and the tree cave. His voice was hoarse but hopeful. When Selene entered, everything else in the room disappeared. "Mom," Aiden whispered. She rushed to him, dropped to her knees, and wrapped her arms around him. He didn't flinch. This time, he held on. Photographers were kept outside. There would be no staged moment, no press-friendly tears. This was real. For the first time in years, Selene Ward felt human again. And outside that tent, a crowd murmured the name of the man who had made it possible. Elias Navarro. The air inside the tent was thick with emotion. Aiden, though weak, reached up and placed his small hand against his mother's cheek. She leaned into the touch, like it was an anchor. "I thought you wouldn't find me," he whispered. "I never stopped looking," she replied. "Never." His eyes flickered. "The farmer did. He found me." Selene nodded slowly. "I know, and I'm going to thank him." But when she emerged from the tent, Elias was already gone. He hadn't stayed to bask in the spotlight. He'd spoken briefly to a field medic, handed over the exact location where he found Aiden, and declined a ride home. Instead, he'd slipped away down an old logging trail, unnoticed by most. Maeve found Selene watching the forest line from a distance. "He left," Maeve said. Selene didn't respond at first. She was thinking, replaying Aiden's words. The farmer had stayed with him, protected him, carried him for miles. Why? What kind of man walks into a forest alone when everyone else has tech, teams, and funding? "I want a full profile," Selene said softly. "Who he is, what he needs." Maeve raised an eyebrow. "You think he wants something?" "No," Selene said, "but I owe him more than money." By the time the sun set again, Elias Navarro had become an international sensation. Someone at the base had posted the photo. Him emerging from the trees, child in arms, face lined with mud and light. The internet erupted. Hashtags bloomed. Articles flooded the digital airwaves. Unknown farmer rescues billionaire's son. The hero in the hills. Man of the soil saves a life. Local news trucks lined up outside his property. Drones flew overhead trying to glimpse the mysterious farmer. A national talk show offered him a guest spot via satellite. Another platform pledged to sponsor his land as a rural restoration project. But Elias didn't want any of it. He turned off the generator, pulled the curtains, left the landline unplugged. His peace wasn't for sale. Still, curiosity grew. Journalists interviewed everyone from nearby, store owners, truckers, school teachers. "He's quiet," said the gas station clerk, "keeps to himself." "A good man," said Mrs. Grady at the post office, "had a hard life." And Selene watched the coverage closely, not because she wanted to exploit it, but because she needed to understand the man her son now spoke about in dreams. "The farmer who saved me," Aiden would whisper. "He didn't even ask my name." A black car arrived at Elias's gate 3 days later. The driver didn't honk, just wait. Elias saw it from his porch, arms crossed, boots dusty. The engine idled. Eventually the back door opened and Selene stepped out. She wore jeans and a soft sweater this time, her hair pulled back. Her eyes were tired but focused. "Mr. Navarro," she said, walking up to the gate. "May I speak with you?" Elias didn't answer right away. He studied her. Not the CEO version, not the media mogul, just a mother. He nodded once. They walked the field slowly, no cameras, no entourage. "I came to thank you," Celine said, "for saving my son." "He saved himself," Elias replied. "I just helped." Celine smiled faintly. "Still, I owe you everything, and I want to repay that debt." Elias stopped. "Don't want money." "I assumed," she said. "But maybe there's something else. Your farm, equipment, access to resources, water." Elias looked at her surprised. "No one ever offers that first," he said. "Water." She nodded. "You've earned more than a paycheck, and my son, he won't stop talking about you." Elias looked away, uncertain. But a seed had been planted. Maybe not all wealth corrupts. Maybe some of it could help something grow. They sat on the porch as the sky turned the color of old pennies. Elias poured black coffee into mismatched mugs. Celine took hers without a word. "You don't need to pay me," Elias said. "But there's a school down by the edge of town." Celine raised an eyebrow. "School? Old, leaky roof, no books for science. Kids ride broken bikes to get there. No internet." She studied him. "You want me to fix the school?" "No," he said. "I want you to invest in it." He set down his mug. "You asked what I wanted. That's it. Not tractors, not ads. Just give those kids a chance." Celine sat back, stunned. She'd expected a modest land deal, maybe debt relief. Not this. And yet something in her shifted. "I'll do it," she said. "Not a charity stunt, a real investment, and I'll put your name on the foundation." "Don't need my name on anything." Celine smiled. "But I'll do it anyway," she said. Elias didn't object. They sat in silence as the stars came out. Two people from opposite worlds, tied now not by money or press, but by a boy who had survived. And maybe, just maybe, by something like trust. For a man who never asked for attention, Elias Navarro now had too much of it. Every major news outlet wanted an interview. His mailbox overflowed with letters, some praising him, some begging for help, others oddly spiritual in tone. Offers poured in, book deals, podcast specials, a documentary crew from Europe proposing a 10-part series titled "The Farmer Who Found the Future." They all missed the point. Elias wasn't trying to be a hero. He'd simply done what no one else had dared. Listened to the woods, trusted his gut, and followed the cry of a scared child. But the world didn't want simplicity. It wanted to be a myth. The more Elias stayed quiet, the more people invented things about him. Articles speculated on his past, some accurate, others outright fiction. One claimed he was a former military tracker. Another suggested he had once lived as a hermit monk in Alaska. Celine tried to control the narrative. She issued statements emphasizing his humility, his decency, his desire for privacy. But even her words weren't enough to slow the momentum. Then came the profiles. A major magazine ran a feature, "The Last Honest Man." It painted Elias as a symbol of the rural spirit, of unbought bravery, of the America people longed for. The article barely mentioned Aiden or Celine. It focused instead on Elias's calloused hands, the cracks in his voice, the history of his losses. Elias didn't read it. He didn't need to. He already knew who he was. But the people around him changed. At the farmer's market, strangers stopped to shake his hand. Local officials invited him to council meetings. teachers asked him to speak at assemblies. "I'm not the story," he told them, but that didn't matter. The story had taken on a life of its own. Back at the school he'd asked Selene to support, new computers arrived. So did a fresh shipment of books and funds for a new science lab. There was talk of building a small greenhouse for agricultural programs named Navarro's Grove. Elias tried to protest, but the children's smiles silenced him. Maybe it wasn't about him anymore. Maybe it was about what came next. With visibility came the inevitable shadows. As Elias's story spread, so did skepticism. The first backlash came on social media. Anonymous accounts accusing him of faking the discovery to claim the reward money, despite the fact that he had turned it down publicly and without hesitation. Conspiracy theories flourished. "Too convenient," one user wrote. Why was he in the woods when no one else found anything? "Staged heroism for a PR redemption arc," another post speculated. Podcasts picked it up. A popular political commentator suggested that Selene orchestrated the rescue herself to soften her icy image. One even implied that Elias was a former employee of her company, a plant designed to humanize her. Selene's team quickly issued clarifying statements, and fact-checkers debunked every claim. But the seed of doubt had been planted. In Pine Grove, some townsfolk who once praised Elias grew suspicious. At the diner, someone joked too loudly about the rich farmer now. At church, a whisper passed behind his back. What if he kept the boy for a while before returning him? Elias heard all of it. He didn't respond, but inside something began to fray. He'd spent a lifetime staying out of the world's way. Now the world had barged in, rebranded him, repurposed him, and criticized him, all within weeks. The only place that offered silence now was the woods. So one morning before dawn, Elias saddled his old mule and disappeared into the hills. No phone, no explanation. When Selene arrived that day with plans for the school's groundbreaking ceremony, she found an empty porch and a cold fire pit. Maeve, now managing most of the foundation logistics, frowned as she scanned the horizon. "Where'd he go?" she asked. Selene didn't answer right away. She stepped up to the porch, ran her hand along the railing, and stared out at the tall grass waving in the wind. "He's not hiding," she said finally. "He's healing." Maeve sighed. "You think he's coming back?" Selene nodded. "He will. He's not done yet." And somewhere deep in the quiet ridges of Stone Marrow Valley, Elias Navarro walked alone, not to escape, but to remember who he was before the world crowned him. Because real heroes don't chase applause, they carry weight in silence. The sun was just rising over the valley when Selene returned to Elias's farm, not with cameras or advisors this time, but alone. She wore hiking boots and jeans, her hair tied back, a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. In one hand, she carried a simple cloth-wrapped parcel. Inside was a small container of fresh fruit, a mason jar of imported honey, and a letter. Not a corporate letterhead. Handwritten, folded, and sealed with care. The gate squeaked as she opened it. The place looked unchanged, modest, weathered, but alive. The wildflowers at the edge of the field had begun to bloom in bursts of gold and lavender. The porch swing rocked slowly in the morning wind, creaking as if greeting her. She stepped up and knocked, even though she knew he wouldn't be there. Maeve had tracked Elias's mule trail deep into the forest days earlier. He'd left intentionally seeking solitude, But Celine hadn't come for a meeting. She'd come to understand him, if only by standing in his world. She left the parcel on the step and wandered through the small field behind the house. Bees danced among rows of struggling squash. The soil was cracked in places, but it held the determination of someone who refused to give up. For a woman who had spent her life mastering satellites and stocks, this was foreign terrain, humbling terrain, and yet grounding. She stayed for nearly an hour, walking the edge of his land, watching the wind press waves through the wheat. When she returned to the house, the parcel was gone. She smiled. Somewhere in the woods, Elias had been watching, not suspiciously, simply waiting. She hadn't come to take anything. And maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe that. Aidan Ward's recovery was both rapid and surprising. Physically, he healed quickly, thanks to a steady stream of top-tier care, nutritionists, and pediatric trauma specialists. But the greater transformation happened somewhere deeper, less visible. Before the disappearance, Aidan had been a withdrawn boy, often glued to tablets, speaking in short, clipped phrases. He preferred digital companions to real ones and rarely smiled unless coaxed. Afterward, something shifted. He asked to go outside more. He wanted to walk, even when he was still weak. He was quieter now, not from fear, but from thoughtfulness. He asked questions about trees, about bees, about how the farmer made fire with just a match and dry leaves. He told Celine about the badger den, how Elias had wrapped him in a coat and hummed quietly when the wind got loud. "He didn't talk much," Aidan said one night, "but he didn't leave me." Celine listened carefully. She didn't interrupt. One afternoon, she found Aidan sitting on the lawn outside the recovery house, holding a book about ecosystems. He pointed to a section on crop rotation and said, "This is what Mr. Elias does, right?" "Yes," Celine said softly. "I want to be like him." The words hit her harder than she expected, not because she was jealous, but because for the first time in her son's life, he had found a real hero. And it wasn't someone on a screen. A week later, Elias returned. No press, no announcement, just the creak of the gate and the thud of boots on the porch as he entered his home like he'd never left. The fire pit was cold, but the hearth was ready. He lit it, boiled water, and sat at the table alone, until there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Celine and Aidan standing under the starlight. No entourage, just them. Aidan held a paper in one hand, a drawing of the badger den, Elias standing nearby, drawn as tall as the trees. "Can we come in?" Celine asked. Elias stepped aside. Dinner was modest: stew, cornbread, and water from the well. They ate at the small wooden table, knees nearly touching. The light from the lantern flickered between them, casting soft shadows on the walls. There were no grand speeches, no emotional breakdowns, just laughter. Aidan laughed at a story about a stubborn mule. Celine smiled when Elias said her city boots would spook the chickens. And Elias, for the first time in years, let out a real chuckle, low and raspy, but full of life. Later, when the boy nodded off against his mother's shoulder, Celine looked across the table. "You saved him," she whispered. Elias shook his head. "Number, he saved us." She didn't correct him, because in that small, flickering room, with silence as their guest, she understood what he meant. 3 weeks after Elias returned from the woods, Celine Ward held a press conference in the most unlikely of places, the Pine Grove Elementary School gymnasium. It wasn't her typical stage. No marble backdrops, no panoramic skyline views, just a room that smelled of dust, pencil shavings, and old linoleum. A faded basketball hoop hung above the podium, and folding chairs squeaked under the weight of every local teacher, student, and reporter crammed into the space. Celine took the stage wearing a simple gray sweater and jeans. Her hair was tied in a loose braid. No heels, no branding. When the cameras rolled, she didn't read from a script. "I'm here not just as the CEO of WardCorps, but as a mother," she began. "3 weeks ago, my son went missing in the forests near this town. In that darkness, I found something more than my child. I found the truth in people this world overlooks." She paused, then glanced toward the second row, where Elias sat quietly beside Aiden. "I met a man who asked for nothing, who saved my son's life, and who reminded me what actual leadership looks like." She turned back to the crowd. "Today, I'm proud to announce the Elias Navarro Rural Advancement Initiative," the audience murmured. "It's a multi-year, privately funded program focused on 3 pillars: education, sustainability, and local infrastructure. And it starts here, with new science labs, refurbished classrooms, and the first rural STEM agriculture hybrid scholarship in the state." Reporters scribbled notes furiously. "But this isn't charity," she continued. "It's restitution. It's balanced, because innovation should not come at the cost of those who feed us. And children, no matter their zip code, deserve futures shaped by opportunity, not scarcity." Applause erupted, not polite, but visceral. Elias leaned slightly toward Aiden, who whispered, "She said your name." He smiled faintly. "She did." And for once, Elias didn't mind being the center of something bigger than himself. When word of the initiative spread, people started showing up at Elias's farm, not as tourists or reporters, but as collaborators. A pair of university students from Berkeley showed up with notebooks and a drone. They asked Elias about soil health, water retention, and crop yield under drought stress. Another young woman, an agricultural engineer from Iowa, volunteered to help repair his irrigation lines. Even government officials took note. A regional environmental agency asked to model Elias's property as a case study in regenerative land use. But for Elias, the greatest transformation happened not in policy, but in rhythm. His days, once defined by isolation, became filled with purpose and the sound of new voices. Students helped clear brush and plant heritage seeds. Engineers installed solar panels and a windmill. He even agreed, reluctantly, to let a journalist film a short documentary, but only if it focused on the land, not on him. The school garden blossomed next. Elias spent 3 afternoons a week there, teaching kids how to tell if compost was ready and which bugs were good for beans. Aiden was always first to arrive, proudly repeating everything Elias said as if reciting gospel. "This soil is alive," he'd declare. "We feed it so it feeds us." Elias didn't laugh, but the corners of his eyes creased every time. One day, after a long afternoon with the children, Selena met Elias by the water barrels behind the school. She handed him a clipboard full of reports, grant applications, and growth projections. He flipped through it slowly. "You know," he muttered, "this used to be a quiet place." She smirked. You miss the silence. He shrugged. Some of it. A moment passed. You built something, she said. Elias shook his head. We did. The breeze carried the scent of earth and basil. In the distance, children laughed. Legacy, Elias realized, wasn't about names on buildings or monuments made of stone. It was about roots, and whether they held strong when the wind blew. The invitations arrived in thick cream envelopes stamped with gold leaf seals. First came the state senate, then the governor's office, then a request from the National Foundation for civic recognition. One even came from the White House. They all wanted the same thing, to honor Elias Navarro, to stand him on a stage, hang medals around his neck, capture photo ops that would live forever in archives and headlines. They called him Guardian of the Forgotten and the Humble Hero. Elias tried to say no. He really did. But Celine convinced him to attend just one ceremony, the state's annual Sustainability and Courage Awards. It wasn't about him, she argued. It was about spotlighting the issues he had brought into focus: neglected lands, underfunded schools, and forgotten lives in rural America. And so, one Saturday evening, Elias found himself standing in a grand ballroom in Sacramento. The chandeliers sparkled like constellations. The floors were polished so smooth he felt like he might slip. He wore a second-hand suit Maeve had found for him. It itched, but when the lights dimmed and his name was called, the entire room rose. Applause thundered as he walked to the stage. He accepted the award with both hands. When asked if he wanted to speak, he looked out at the crowd and said, "I don't like speeches, I like soil." A few people laughed. But if you've got land, care for it. If you've got kids, teach them to listen to it. And if someone's crying in the dark, don't wait for a helicopter. Just go. That was all. He stepped down, walked back to his table, and picked up his glass of water. No champagne, no standing ovation encore, just quiet satisfaction. Later, back at the hotel, Aiden ran up and hugged him. "You were amazing," the boy said. "Everyone loved it." "I didn't say much," Elias replied. "That's why it was perfect," Aiden said. And somewhere inside, Elias knew the boy was right. Celine Ward was never the type to hesitate. Her decisions were typically clean, swift, and surgical, designed to disrupt markets, flatten rivals, and keep WardCorp on the bleeding edge of innovation. But this decision was different. She sat in her penthouse office overlooking San Francisco Bay, the same view that had once inspired her to build a global tech empire. The sun filtered through the glass like gold dust, shimmering off her steel and marble desk. Her executive team waited outside, murmuring through spreadsheets and projections, unaware that she was about to upend everything. In her hand was a resignation letter, handwritten, no legal jargon, no strategic ambiguity, just a few lines that had taken her weeks to craft. It had been 2 months since Aiden's rescue, 2 months since Elias Navarro walked out of the forest, carrying the most valuable person in her world, not just her son, but the only tether left to her own lost humanity. The world had seen the transformation first. Analysts noted her absence from shareholder calls. Her PR team fielded questions about her extended leave and the increasing autonomy of the company's board. Rumors swirled. Was she sick? Being pushed out? But the truth was simpler. Celine had changed, not superficially, fundamentally. The version of her that once saw people as units of efficiency had been dismantled the moment she saw her son's frail body in the arms of a stranger who didn't even know his name. It was Elias who'd planted the seed, but it was Aiden who had nurtured it. He talked constantly about the farm, about compost, trees, and wind patterns. He no longer asked for new apps or gadgets. He asked about water cycles and why birds flew in V-shapes. He wanted to plant things, watch them grow, protect them. Celine realized she had built a world her son no longer belonged to, and neither did she. So she made the call. That morning, before the sun rose, she met with WardCorps' legal team in a quiet downtown hotel. She outlined the transfer of her authority to her COO and placed her shares in a trust designed to support rural development programs across the U.S. Then she disappeared into the quiet. Now, holding the letter one final time, she felt a flicker of fear. Not because she was walking away from billions, but because she wasn't sure what kind of person she was without that power. Just then, her assistant, Thomas, knocked softly. "They're ready for you, Ms. Ward." She stood, smoothed her blazer, and walked out of her office like a general stepping off a battlefield. In the boardroom, the executive stood when she entered. Old habit, old hierarchy. She waved it away and walked to the head of the table. "I'll be brief," she said, setting the letter down in front of her. "This morning I'm stepping down as CEO of WardCorps, effective immediately." Gasps, blinking faces, a few stunned murmurs. "I've spent 20 years building this company," she continued. "I don't regret that, but somewhere along the way, I forgot what I was building it for." One of the younger board members, a rising star from Silicon Valley, leaned forward. "Celine, if this is about what happened to your son—" She cut him off. "It's entirely about my son, and about people like Elias Navarro, who are doing more to repair the world than any server farm or software stack I've built." The room went quiet. "I'm not asking for applause," she added. "Just respect the fact that I'm walking away because I need to build something different now, something real." She signed the letter. A moment later, she handed the company to people who once dreamed of replacing her. But there was no sadness, no ceremony, just relief. Outside, the city buzzed with morning ambition, but Celine walked alone toward her car, slipped into the driver's seat, and took a long, slow breath. She didn't know exactly what her future looked like, but she had a sense of where it started. She turned the ignition and headed north, toward a small town with a crooked porch swing, an honest man with dirt under his nails, and a boy waiting in a garden holding a packet of seeds. The envelope was small, child-sized, addressed in wobbly pencil letters. It arrived one morning tucked between seed catalogs and farm supply flyers left at the edge of Elias's porch by a delivery boy who didn't wait to be thanked. Elias recognized the handwriting immediately. He sat on the porch steps, steaming mug in hand, and opened the letter carefully, as if unwrapping something fragile. Inside was a folded sheet of thick white paper. At the top, written in large block letters, were the words, "Dear Mr. Elias, thank you for finding me. I think maybe the forest helped you. I think maybe the trees were talking to you. I think maybe you talked back to them too. I don't remember everything about those days, but I remember your coat smelled like smoke and mint. I remember how you didn't yell, not even once. I remember you told me the wind wasn't scary, just strong. I want to learn how to grow things, not just little things, big things too, like trees and apples and maybe hope. Mom says I should ask if you'll teach me this summer. I don't want screens anymore. I want soil. Love, Aiden. P.S. I drew something for you. Elias turned over the page. On the back was a simple crayon drawing, a tall man in a wide-brimmed hat, kneeling beside a sapling. Beside him, a child held a watering can. Over them was a sun made of orange spirals, and above it all, a bird in mid-flight. Elias read the letter again, then a third time. The corners of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but something deeper, something close to awe. He stood, stepped into his boots, and went out to the field behind the house. There, in the middle of his garden plot, he cleared a small patch of soil. He planted a single new seedling, not because he needed more food, but because someone, a child, had asked to grow something that would last. The town was beginning to talk again, but this time the whispers weren't skeptical. They were curious, speculative, even hopeful. It started with sightings. Selene walked through the market on a Saturday morning, basket in hand, wearing a canvas jacket and no makeup. Elias stood beside her, offering her a jar of wildflower honey like it was the most natural thing in the world. Then came the late afternoons. Selene's car, dusty now, always parked the same way, appeared outside Elias's gate more and more often. She stayed for hours at a time, helping with bee boxes, learning the rhythm of weeding, sitting in the quiet with Aiden while Elias worked nearby. They didn't act like a couple, not in the conventional sense. No hand-holding, no long glances. But there was something else, an ease, a shared silence that spoke louder than words. People noticed. At the diner, Maeve fielded the first question with a smirk. Are they a thing now? She sipped her coffee. I think they're becoming something better than a thing. Elias didn't discuss it. He never had much use for town gossip, but even he had begun to sense the shift. He found himself listening for her car, looking forward to her questions, noticing how Aiden had started to hum when she was nearby, happily, like the boy finally had a complete melody to sing. One evening, Selene stayed for dinner again. This time she brought the meal, roasted squash and sourdough bread she'd tried baking herself. It's too salty, she warned. It's fine, Elias said after one bite. Your oven's just honest. She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that started in the chest and rolled upward, something she hadn't done in years without effort. Aiden sat between them, showing off a drawing of a compost cycle he'd made for school. We're going to build a bug hotel next week, he said proudly. You both have to help. Selene smiled. Of course. Elias nodded. Just don't let the spiders check in without a deposit. Later that night, after Aiden had fallen asleep in the hammock under the porch rafters, Selene stayed a little longer. They sat in quiet again, the cicadas providing a soft backdrop. The lantern-flickered stars began to claim the sky. You ever think, Selene asked softly, how strange this is? Elias didn't look at her. Strange is fine, better than empty. She glanced sideways at him. You think this, whatever this is, could last? Now he did look at her. His eyes were steady, the way the mountains were steady. If we keep planting, he said, it'll grow. She didn't press for anything more. Neither of them needed grand declarations, because some bonds aren't forged in fireworks. They take shape slowly over late harvests, quiet storms, and the unspoken relief of finding another soul who doesn't want to fix you, just walk beside you. That night, as Selene drove back toward the valley, her headlights sweeping over empty roads and starlit fields, she felt something she hadn't in decades. Not triumph, not ambition, belonging. The sound of the helicopter returned, not like a threat this time, but like an echo of a memory reimagined. It came low over the hills on a crisp morning in early fall, a soft thrum that stirred the leaves and tilted the scarecrow in Elias's field slightly to the left. Aiden looked up from his compost pile, shading his eyes. "They're back," he said, excited. Selene stepped out of the house, brushing her hands on her jeans. Elias was already on the porch, sipping coffee. A clean black helicopter settled in the clearing behind the farmhouse, kicking up dust but no alarm. This time there was no media, no bodyguards, no panic. Just a man in a charcoal suit who stepped down carrying a leather case and a nervous smile. "Mr. Navarro?" the man asked. Elias nodded. "I'm from the UN Development Program. You've been invited to speak at the Global Forum on Sustainability next month in Geneva. They've heard about the initiative here, about your work." Elias didn't say anything at first. He glanced at Selene, who was watching quietly, half smiling. "They want me to talk about dirt?" he finally asked. The man chuckled nervously, "About resilience, regeneration, and hope." Elias sighed. "Hope doesn't wear a tie." "But it listens when someone like you speaks." The offer was real. Expenses covered, a 15-minute speech, a spotlight that could ripple out to inspire communities across the globe. Elias had never been on a plane, never been farther than the state line in 20 years, and yet, that evening around the dinner table, he unfolded the invitation again. Aiden sat beside him eating soup. Selene refilled his glass with water. "Should I go?" Elias asked, not looking at either of them. "You'd hate the suits," Selene said, "but the world could learn something." Aiden piped up. "You could tell them about the worm farm." Elias laughed, a full belly-deep laugh. "All right," he said, "let's go show them how to listen to the ground." It was a Sunday morning when Selene asked Elias to walk with her. They took the path behind the school, through the maple grove that had begun to turn gold and crimson with autumn. Aiden trailed ahead, chasing leaves, singing quietly to himself. Selene held a thin envelope in her hand. She hadn't said much on the drive over, but Elias could sense something shifting. He didn't press her. They reached a stone marker beside the creek, an old boundary post once used by loggers. Selene stopped and handed him the envelope. He opened it without ceremony. Inside were a single key and a legal document. He scanned the first few lines and froze. It was a deed to 80 acres of land, his land, the same land his family had lost years ago to foreclosure after the flood, the same land he'd walked by 100 times knowing it would never be his again. "I bought it back," Selene said softly, quietly, "through a shell firm so no one would outbid. You don't owe me anything. It's yours." Elias stared at the paper, then at the trees around them. He was speechless. "I know land can't replace what you lost," she continued, "but maybe it can grow something new." He folded the document carefully, slid the key into his coat pocket, and nodded once. "Thank you," he said, "not just for the land, for everything." "You gave me back my son," she replied. "I'm just trying to pay it forward." They stood in silence, watching Aiden toss pebbles into the stream. It was no longer about what they'd lost. It was about what they'd rebuilt. On the first anniversary of Aiden's return, they gathered by the tree. It wasn't a crowd, just a few close friends, teachers, farmers, students from the school, and Maeve, who had become something of a beloved local legend for fending off media vultures with unmatched sarcasm. The site was just inside the forest, near the place where Elias had first found Aiden. He remembered every rock, every bend in the trees. The badger den had long collapsed, but the feeling of that night lived on in the air. Aiden held a young sapling, an oak, small and determined, its roots wrapped in burlap. "This is for here," he said, "for when I was scared, but the forest kept me safe." Celine knelt beside him, helping loosen the roots. Elias dug the hole with slow, steady strokes. When it was ready, they placed the tree into the earth together. No speeches, no banners, just dirt under their nails and wind in their hair. A plaque was set nearby, simple and unpolished. Here a child was found. Here the world changed. May what grows here remind us to listen. Always. As the tree stood upright, its leaves shaking gently in the breeze, Elias stepped back and looked up. In its shadow stood a woman who had once been unreachable, a boy who had once been lost, and a life that had once felt over. And somehow, beneath that sky, they all belonged. The rooster crowed before the sun broke over the hills. Elias was already awake, not because he had to be. There was no frost to beat, no urgent chore waiting, but because sleep came differently now. Lighter, filled with dreams instead of shadows. He sat on the porch with a mug of black coffee wrapped in the blanket Celine had stitched herself. Rough wool, imperfect, warm. The early autumn air bit at his cheeks, but it felt clean, alive. In the distance, the first light of dawn spilled over the horizon, washing the valley in hues of lavender and gold. Aiden would be up soon. Saturdays were for learning how to prune vines and track the wind. The boy now kept a notebook filled with sketches, soil samples, and pressed leaves, his field book of life. Elias smiled into his cup. The sound of feet padding across the wooden floor behind him made him glance back. Celine appeared in the doorway, wrapped in an oversized sweater, her hair tangled from sleep. No board meetings, no interviews. Just a woman with nowhere else she needed to be. "Coffee?" he asked. She nodded, and he poured her a cup from the old thermos. They sat together in silence, side by side, watching as the sun tipped fully over the ridge. It had been a year since everything changed, a year since a boy vanished into the forest, a year since a quiet man listened to the wind and followed it into legend, a year since Celine Ward rediscovered what it meant to love without condition, to give without expecting a return. The world had moved on in its own way. News cycles faded. Journalists stopped calling. The tech press declared Celine's withdrawal from WardCorps the most graceful corporate exit in modern history. Her legacy in Silicon Valley was cemented, but she no longer cared. What mattered now was here. The school flourished. The new science wing, funded by the Navarro Initiative, opened in September. Kids built greenhouses, tested solar ovens, and learned to listen to the land. The farm grew too, more than just crops. It had become a place where people came to learn, to breathe, to heal. Aiden had planted his first orchard, 3 tiny apple trees, each named after a story Elias had told him. Old Knuckle, Sunhide, and Crow's sister. He spoke to them like friends. "I think they remember things," he'd said once. Elias didn't correct him. That morning, Aiden burst onto the porch with dirt on his cheeks and grass stuck to his socks. "There's a fawn in the east pasture," he announced. "It was just born. I saw it." "Go slow," Elias said. "Keep your voice soft. Let the mother see you before you get too close." Aiden nodded, already sprinting back through the field, this time quieter as instructed. Celine laughed. "Still working on the slow part." "He'll get there," Elias said. "He already listens better than most grown men." The breeze carried the scent of mint and tilled soil. A hawk circled high overhead, cutting across the pale morning sky. Celine leaned her head on Elias's shoulder. "You ever think we'd end up here?" she asked softly. He thought for a moment, then shook his head. "I used to think my life ended the night I lost Matteo, that the world had already used up my purpose." He paused, took another sip of coffee. "But then I heard Aiden's cry in the trees, and it wasn't just his voice. It was a second chance." Celine was quiet, but her hand found his fingers curling into the lines of his palm. "I thought I had everything," she whispered. "Money, influence, control. But I didn't have this, not until I lost almost everything else." Elias didn't reply. He didn't need to. The silence between them said enough. The sun had fully risen now, casting long golden light across the farmhouse, the garden rows, the fence lines, and the field where a small boy crouched beside a fawn, watching gently as life began again. Aiden waved from a distance, his grin wide, hair wild, and in that moment Elias Navarro saw the future, not as a concept or a problem to fix, but as something that was already growing, slow and steady, rooted deep in the soil of second chances. He took a deep breath. This was no longer just his land. This was a beginning, a place where broken things become whole again, a field of miracles.